Here's an expanded, natural version of Part 1, keeping it engaging and YouTube friendly. On an ordinary autumn morning, when leaves painted the streets of Detroit in shades of red and gold, 16-year-old Keisha made her way to school. The crisp morning air nipped at her cheeks as she pulled her favorite purple jacket closer, her backpack heavy with books for her upcoming history test. The neighborhood was just waking up. The smell of fresh bread wafted from the corner bakery, and early birds rushed past with their coffee cups in hand. Keisha couldn't help but smile, remembering how her mom had made her favorite breakfast that morning: blueberry pancakes with a drizzle of maple syrup. She'd been up since dawn, cramming for her exams and mentally preparing for track practice later that day. Coach had been pushing the team hard for the upcoming state championships, and Keisha was determined to beat her personal best in the 400-meter dash. As she walked, she scrolled through her phone, checking messages from her best friend about their study plans for lunch break. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the usual morning crowd filled the streets. Kids heading to school, people rushing to work, and elderly neighbors taking their morning walks. The familiar route to school felt different that day, though Keisha couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught the morning dew on the grass, or perhaps it was the unusual quiet that seemed to hang in the air. She'd walked this path hundreds of times before, passing the same old oak trees, the bright blue house with white trim, and Mr. Chen's grocery store, where she often stopped for after-school snacks. Her mind wandered to the track meet coming up next month. She'd been training extra hard, waking up early for morning runs and staying late after school for additional practice. Her dad had promised to take time off work to watch her compete, the first time he'd be able to see her run this season. The thought made her heart swell with excitement and nervousness. As she approached Marshall Avenue, Keisha adjusted her backpack straps and checked her watch. She was running a bit early today, which was unusual for her. Maybe she'd have time to stop by her locker and organize her books before first period. The morning traffic was picking up, with more cars filling the streets as the workday began. Little did Keisha know that in the next few moments, her ordinary Thursday would transform into something extraordinary. The universe had placed her in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, though she had no way of knowing that yet. Sometimes the most remarkable moments come when we least expect them, turning an average day into one that changes not only our own lives but the lives of others as well. Walking past the local coffee shop, Keisha waved to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was setting up the outdoor chairs. The morning regulars were already lined up for their daily caffeine fix, creating a buzz of cheerful conversation. The smell of freshly ground coffee beans mixed with the autumn air, creating that perfect morning atmosphere that made Keisha love her neighborhood even more. As she approached the busy intersection where she usually crossed to get to school, Keisha pulled out her earbuds, ready to put on her favorite playlist. Her mom always reminded her to be extra careful at this crossing, and even though she sometimes rolled her eyes at the warning, she always followed it. Safety first, as her parents had drilled into her head since she was little. The peaceful morning shattered in an instant. As Keisha approached Marshall Avenue, something caught her eye. A silver sit-in moving strangely through the intersection. The car wasn't following the normal flow of traffic. Instead, it weaved back and forth like a boat on choppy waters. At first, she thought maybe the driver was texting, but something in her gut told her this was different. The car, an old Toyota Camry, suddenly jumped the curb with a harsh scraping sound that made nearby pedestrians jump. The front tires bumped over the concrete, and a thin stream of smoke started curling up from under the hood. Through the windshield, Keisha could see an elderly woman with silver hair slumped sideways against the steering wheel. Time seemed to slow down. The busy street around her faded into background noise as Keisha focused on the scene unfolding before her. A mother pushing a stroller quickly moved away from the sidewalk. Someone nearby shouted, "Call 911." But everyone seemed frozen in place, watching the car continue its slow roll toward the busy intersection ahead. The smell of burning rubber filled the air, making Keisha's nose wrinkle. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind stayed surprisingly clear. All those safety videos they'd watched in health class flashed through her mind. She remembered her teacher's words. In an emergency, every second counts. Dropping her backpack on the sidewalk, Keisha sprinted toward the car. She could hear people shouting at her to stay back, but she kept moving forward. The car was still crawling forward, maybe 5 or 10 miles per hour, but heading straight for the morning traffic. Through the window, she could see the driver's face clearly now, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, completely unconscious. More smoke poured from under the hood, and the acrid smell grew stronger. Keisha's hands trembled slightly as she ran alongside the moving vehicle, but her determination didn't waver. She could see other cars in the intersection ahead, drivers unaware of the danger slowly rolling their way. A large delivery truck was turning left. Its driver couldn't possibly see the out-of-control car approaching. The morning sun glinted off the car's side mirror, temporarily blinding Keisha as she reached for the door handle. She silently prayed it wasn't locked. Her track practice had never felt as important as it did in this moment. Every stride, every sprint had prepared her for these crucial seconds. Time was running out. The intersection was getting closer, and the morning traffic was picking up. Keisha could hear sirens in the distance, but they sounded too far away. She knew she had to act now. The weight of the moment pressed down on her shoulders. One person's life, maybe more, depended on what she did in the next few seconds. The cold metal of the door handle pressed against her palm as she reached out, running alongside the slowly moving car. Her sneakers pounded against the pavement, matching the rapid beating of her heart. Everything she'd learned about emergency situations raced through her mind, mixing with her mother's constant reminders about being careful and her father's lessons about helping others in need. This was the moment everything changed for Keisha, for the unconscious woman in the car, and for everyone watching from the sidewalk. The next few seconds would test everything she knew about courage, quick thinking, and doing the right thing, even when it seemed dangerous. Keisha's mind raced as fast as her feet while she kept pace with the moving car. Every second felt like an eternity as she thought through what needed to be done. The door handle was right there, but a million questions flashed through her head. What if the door was locked? What if she couldn't stop the car in time? What if she made things worse? Her track coach always said that hesitation was a runner's worst enemy. Right now, hesitation could mean disaster. The intersection loomed closer, and the morning traffic wasn't slowing down. She could still hear sirens in the distance, but they seemed too far away to help in time. Sweat beaded on her forehead, despite the cool morning air. Her lungs burned from running alongside the car, but she pushed the discomfort aside. The elderly woman inside hadn't moved, still slumped over the steering wheel. Each passing second felt like watching a slow-motion movie heading toward a terrible ending. Taking a deep breath, Keisha reached for the door handle. Her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, and she said a quick prayer. With one swift motion, she pulled, and to her enormous relief, the door opened. The hard part wasn't over, though. It was just beginning. The car was still moving, and now she had to somehow get inside without falling or getting hurt. Years of watching action movies hadn't prepared her for how tricky this would actually be. She gripped the door frame tightly and managed to pull herself partially into the car while still running alongside it. The inside of the car smelled like vanilla air freshener mixed with something burning. A small crystal angel hung from the rearview mirror, swaying back and forth with the car's movement. On the passenger seat, a bag of groceries had spilled over, oranges rolling around on the floor. Keisha could see the elderly woman's chest rising and falling. She was breathing. Thank goodness. A small photo was clipped to the sun visor above the steering wheel. The woman smiling with what looked like her grandchildren. That image made everything feel even more urgent and real. The car was still creeping forward, now just 30 feet from the busy intersection. Keisha knew she had to act fast. She reached across the unconscious woman, trying to be careful not to hurt her while also racing against time. The steering wheel was warm under her hands as she gripped it, attempting to maintain control of the vehicle. Her heart pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. Everything her parents had taught her about driving flashed through her mind. Where the gear shift should be, how to put it in park, where the key would be. Theory was about to become very real practice, and there was no room for mistakes. Behind her, she could hear people shouting encouragement and warnings. Someone was yelling about the truck in the intersection, about to turn directly into their path. Keisha blocked it all out, focusing only on what she needed to do next. This was it, the moment where everything would either go terribly wrong or somehow work out right. With shaking hands but steady determination, Keisha stretched across the front seat of the moving car. The gear shift was right there, but reaching it while half-hanging through the driver's door was trickier than she'd imagined. Her feet scrambled to keep pace with the vehicle as she leaned in further. The unconscious woman's body was heavy against the steering wheel, making it hard for Keisha to reach the controls. She could feel the heat from the engine through the dashboard, and the smell of burning rubber was getting stronger. The intersection was now just 20 feet away, and she could hear the rumble of the approaching delivery truck. "Please work, please work," Keisha whispered as her fingers finally wrapped around the gear shift. With one swift motion, she pulled it into park. The car jerked roughly, making a horrible grinding sound that seemed to echo through the street. But it worked. The car shuddered to a stop, just 15 feet from the busy intersection. Not wasting a second, Keisha reached for the keys, turning off the ignition. The engine died with a sputter, and suddenly everything seemed eerily quiet. The only sounds were her own heavy breathing and the distant sirens getting closer. The morning sun streamed through the windshield, illuminating small particles of dust floating in the air. Now came the harder part. Keisha carefully unbuckled the elderly woman's seatbelt, trying to support her body so she wouldn't slump forward. Up close, she could see the woman's pale face, her silver hair neatly pinned back, a delicate pearl necklace around her neck. She looked so fragile, like a porcelain doll that might break with the slightest wrong move. The woman's skin felt cool to the touch as Keisha checked for a pulse like they'd taught her in summer camp. She found it, weak but steady. A wave of relief washed over her, but she knew they weren't out of danger yet. The smoke from the engine was getting thicker, and a small crowd had gathered around the car. Someone handed Keisha a bottle of water through the window. She gently dabbed some on the woman's forehead and wrists, speaking softly to her even though she wasn't sure if she could hear. "You're going to be okay. Help is coming. Just stay with me. Please stay with me." The sound of sirens grew louder, and Keisha could see the flashing lights reflecting off nearby windows. Her legs felt like jelly now that the adrenaline was wearing off, but she stayed focused on the elderly woman. She kept checking her breathing, kept talking to her, kept hoping the paramedics would arrive quickly. Time seemed to move differently now, no longer racing by in heart-pounding seconds, but stretching out like honey dripping from a spoon. Keisha held the woman's hand, noticing her perfectly manicured nails and a golden wedding ring that had probably been there for decades. She wondered about this woman's life, her family, all the people who would be grateful to know she was still breathing. Through the car windows, Keisha could hear people talking excitedly, some recording with their phones, others directing traffic around the stopped car. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was the steady rise and fall of the elderly woman's chest and the approaching sound of help finally arriving. The paramedics arrived in a blur of flashing lights and urgent movements. Keisha quickly told them everything she'd noticed, how the car had been moving, the woman's condition, and what she'd done to help. She remembered her first aid training from summer camp, explaining how she'd checked for breathing and pulse, careful to keep the woman stable. The morning sun now felt hot on Keisha's back as she stepped aside to let the professionals work. Her hands were still shaking slightly, and her school uniform was wrinkled from the rescue. She watched as they carefully moved the elderly woman onto a stretcher, attaching monitors and speaking in quick, precise medical terms. One of the paramedics, a kind-faced woman with gray-streaked hair, turned to Keisha while her partners prepared for transport. "You did everything right," she said, squeezing Keisha's shoulder. "Those first minutes are crucial in a stroke. Your quick thinking probably saved her life." The word stroke hung in the air like a heavy weight. Keisha watched as they checked the woman's vital signs, noting how her face had drooped slightly on one side. One of the warning signs they'd learned about in health class. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, each movement purposeful and precise. The elderly woman started to stir as they lifted her into the ambulance. Her eyes fluttered open, confused and frightened. Keisha stepped forward instinctively, taking her hand. "You're okay," she said softly. "These people are here to help you. Everything's going to be fine." The woman's fingers tightened weakly around hers, and Keisha saw tears forming in her eyes. Police officers had arrived too, and they were busy taking statements from witnesses. The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones out, recording everything. Keisha barely noticed them. She was focused on the gentle squeeze of the woman's hand, the look of gratitude in her eyes that said more than words could. The lead paramedic explained they were taking her to City General Hospital, the best stroke center in the area. Time was critical, but they were well within the golden hour when treatment would be most effective. Keisha felt a wave of relief wash over her, knowing she'd helped give this woman her best chance. As they prepared to close the ambulance doors, the woman managed to whisper something. Her voice was weak but clear. "Thank you, Angel." Keisha felt tears welling up in her own eyes as she watched the ambulance pull away, sirens wailing as it headed toward the hospital. Standing there on the sidewalk, Keisha suddenly realized she was going to be late for school. Her backpack still lay where she'd dropped it, her history test completely forgotten in the chaos of the morning. But somehow, none of that seemed important anymore. She had just learned the most valuable lesson of her life, and it wasn't something she could find in any textbook. A police officer approached with a notepad, ready to take her statement. Looking at the flashing lights, the scattered oranges still rolling around the stopped car, and the crowd of people talking excitedly, Keisha took a deep breath. This ordinary Thursday morning had turned into something extraordinary, and she knew her life would never be quite the same. The aftermath of Keisha's quick thinking unfolded rapidly in the hours following the rescue. At City General Hospital, doctors confirmed what the paramedics had suspected. Mrs. Wilson had experienced a minor stroke while driving. The medical team immediately began treatment, using the latest clot-busting medications that work best when administered quickly after symptoms begin. The hospital waiting room filled with Mrs. Wilson's family, her daughter rushing in from work, her son flying in from Chicago. When they heard about the young girl who had saved their mother, tears flowed freely. The doctors explained how critical those first minutes had been, how Keisha's quick response had made all the difference between recovery and permanent damage. Back at school, Keisha walked into her first period class 2 hours late, still wearing her rumpled uniform. Her history teacher looked up, ready to scold her for tardiness, but stopped short when a police officer followed her in. The officer explained everything to the class, and suddenly, Keisha's missed test didn't seem important anymore. News spread through the school like wildfire. Students who'd never spoken to her before stopped to shake her hand. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages and social media notifications. Local news vans parked outside the school, their reporters eager to interview the teenage hero who'd saved an elderly woman's life. But what touched Keisha most was the call she received that evening. Mrs. Wilson's daughter had tracked down her number through the police report. She called to say her mother was doing well, responding to treatment, and asking to meet the angel who saved her. The doctors were optimistic about her recovery, saying that without such quick medical attention, the outcome could have been very different. The local newspaper ran the story on their front page. "Teen's quick thinking saves life," read the headline, above a photo of Keisha taken at the scene. The article praised not just her bravery, but her knowledge of stroke symptoms and proper emergency response. The reporter emphasized how she kept calm under pressure, making all the right decisions in those crucial moments. By the end of that eventful day, Keisha sat on her bed, scrolling through hundreds of supportive messages. Her parents sat beside her, pride shining in their eyes. Her father, usually quiet and reserved, kept saying, "That's my girl," while her mother alternated between hugging her and wiping away tears. Her track coach called to say she could skip practice, but Keisha decided to go anyway. Running always helped her think, and she had a lot to process. As she jogged around the track that afternoon, she realized something important. Heroism wasn't about being fearless or super strong. It was about being ready to help when help was needed, about remembering what you've learned and using it when it matters most. The day ended with Keisha getting another piece of news. Mrs. Wilson was already showing signs of improvement. The quick medical intervention meant she would likely make a full recovery, ready to return to her grandchildren, her garden club, and all the other parts of her life that might have been lost without Keisha's intervention. All these events swirled through Keisha's mind as she lay in bed that night, exhausted but unable to sleep. One thought kept coming back. Sometimes the most important tests in life aren't the ones you study for. In the days following the rescue, Keisha's story spread through the community like wildfire. The mayor's office called to announce they wanted to present her with a Civilian Bravery Award during the next city council meeting. While Keisha felt a bit overwhelmed by all the attention, her parents couldn't have been prouder. The award ceremony was held in the Grand City Hall chamber, its walls lined with historical photographs and elaborate wooden panels. The room was packed with city officials, community members, and news crews. Keisha sat in the front row, wearing her favorite blue dress, her hands folded nervously in her lap as the mayor approached the podium. As the mayor spoke about courage and community service, Keisha noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Her track team sat together, wearing their team jackets. Her teachers beamed from their seats. Even Mr. Chen from the grocery store had closed his shop early to attend. The support from her community brought tears to her eyes. The presentation wasn't just about the award, though. The city's emergency services director announced a new initiative inspired by Keisha's actions. They would be launching a free first aid and emergency response training program for all high school students in the district. The program would ensure that more young people would know what to do in crisis situations. Local businesses joined in to support the initiative. The community college offered to host training sessions, and several medical professionals volunteered to teach. Insurance companies pledged funding for equipment and materials. What started as one girl's quick thinking was growing into something much bigger. During her acceptance speech, Keisha spoke from her heart. She talked about how anyone could be a hero if they paid attention in their classes, stayed calm under pressure, and cared enough to help others. Her voice shook slightly, but her words rang true throughout the chamber. She emphasized that the real hero was Mrs. Wilson, who was fighting hard to recover. After the ceremony, several students approached Keisha asking how they could learn first aid. The school principal announced they would be starting an emergency response club, and the sign-up sheet filled up immediately. Young people were inspired to learn how they could make a difference in their community. Local media covered the story extensively, but what touched Keisha most were the letters. People wrote sharing their own stories of medical emergencies, thanking her for bringing attention to the importance of quick response and basic medical knowledge. Many came from elderly people who lived alone, expressing how much safer they felt knowing young people in their community were learning these skills. The day ended with a surprise. A video message from Mrs. Wilson in her hospital room, getting stronger every day. She called Keisha her guardian angel and invited her to visit once she was back home. As Keisha watched the message, surrounded by her family and friends, she realized that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions. Through it all, Keisha remained humble, always redirecting praise to the importance of education and community support. She knew that her story wasn't just about one brave moment, it was about being prepared, staying calm, and caring enough to act when someone needed help. When Mrs. Wilson returned home from the hospital, Keisha finally got to meet her properly. The elderly woman's house was a charming brick cottage filled with books. She had been a librarian for over 40 years before retiring. As they sat in her cozy living room sharing tea and homemade cookies, it felt like the beginning of something special. Mrs. Wilson's recovery was remarkable. Her doctors credited the quick medical response, but she credited Keisha. As they talked, Mrs. Wilson shared stories from her years at the library, her eyes lighting up when she discovered Keisha's love for reading. Her home office walls were covered with photographs of students she'd helped over the years, many now successful professionals who still kept in touch. Their friendship grew naturally. Keisha started visiting every Wednesday after track practice. They discussed books, share stories, and sometimes just sit quietly reading together. Mrs. Wilson had an incredible collection of classics and modern literature, and she began recommending books that perfectly matched Keisha's interests. When Keisha mentioned her struggles with SAT preparation, Mrs. Wilson's face lit up. As a former librarian, she knew exactly how to help. Together, they created study schedules, practiced vocabulary, and worked through complex reading passages. Mrs. Wilson's teaching style was patient and encouraging, helping Keisha gain confidence in her abilities. The neighborhood noticed their unlikely friendship. People would smile seeing Keisha help Mrs. Wilson tend her garden or carry groceries. The age gap between them seemed to disappear as they worked side by side, sharing stories and laughter. Mrs. Wilson's grandchildren began joining their Wednesday sessions, turning them into vibrant multi-generational gatherings. During college application season, Mrs. Wilson became Keisha's biggest supporter. She helped edit essays, shared wisdom about college life, and wrote a heartfelt recommendation letter. Her years of experience helping students with college applications proved invaluable. When acceptance letters started arriving, Mrs. Wilson was among the first to celebrate Keisha's successes. Their bond extended beyond academics. Mrs. Wilson attended Keisha's track meets, cheering loudly from the stands. Keisha helped Mrs. Wilson learn to use social media to connect with her grandchildren. They celebrated holidays together, sharing family traditions and creating new ones. The local newspaper did a follow-up story about their friendship, focusing on how a moment of crisis had led to such a meaningful connection. The article highlighted how their relationship had enriched both their lives and inspired others in the community to bridge generational gaps. As months passed, their weekly meetings became cherished traditions. They discovered that heroism wasn't just about dramatic rescues. Sometimes it was about showing up consistently, sharing wisdom, and caring deeply for another person. Their friendship became a testament to how life's most challenging moments can lead to its most beautiful connections. Their story became known throughout town as an example of how age differences and backgrounds don't matter when it comes to true friendship. It showed everyone that sometimes the most unexpected circumstances can bring people together in ways that change both their lives forever. 1 year after the life-changing rescue, Keisha organized a community event that would transform her neighborhood. Inspired by her experience and friendship with Mrs. Wilson, she founded the Youth Emergency Response Program at her high school. The program started small, with just 20 students meeting in the library after school. The idea was simple but powerful. Train young people in basic emergency response, first aid, and crisis management. Mrs. Wilson helped design the curriculum, using her years of teaching experience to make the lessons engaging and memorable. They created practical scenarios, invited medical professionals as guest speakers, and organized hands-on training sessions. Word spread quickly. Other schools in the district started asking about the program. Keisha and Mrs. Wilson worked together to create a handbook that could help other schools start their own chapters. Local hospitals provided equipment for training, and retired medical professionals volunteered their time to teach specialized sessions. The program went beyond just medical training. Students learned about community awareness, looking out for elderly neighbors, and the importance of quick thinking in emergencies. They practiced scenarios involving common situations, from helping someone who had fallen to recognizing signs of medical distress. As the program grew, so did its impact. Students started volunteering at local senior centers, creating emergency contact lists for elderly residents, and organizing neighborhood watch groups. They developed a buddy system where young people would check on elderly neighbors during extreme weather conditions. The local news did another story, this time focusing on how one heroic act had sparked a movement. They interviewed program participants who shared stories of using their training to help family members and strangers alike. The piece ended with Keisha and Mrs. Wilson sitting in the garden, talking about how sometimes the scariest moments in life can lead to the most beautiful changes. Soon, other cities began reaching out, wanting to start similar programs. Keisha and Mrs. Wilson found themselves giving presentations at youth leadership conferences, sharing their story and helping others create their own emergency response initiatives. Their program became a model for youth engagement and community safety. The most rewarding moments came when students shared their own success stories, helping a neighbor during a health scare, recognizing stroke symptoms in a grandparent, or simply being there for someone in need. Each story proved that their program was making a real difference in people's lives. By the end of the year, what started as one girl's quick thinking had grown into a movement that touched hundreds of lives. It showed that heroism isn't just about one dramatic moment. It's about creating lasting change that helps others become heroes too.